Everyone. It's been a few weeks since we've had one of our Facebook lives. Busy season for everybody, but today we're joined by Nathan from the Bokeh podcast, and also for Photographers Edits. He does a lot of other things as well. I'm sure he'll get into some of those things in a second. But yeah, Nathan, say hello to everybody. Tell us whatever you want to tell us about yourself.
Let's see. I once juggled a soccer ball for 15 minutes. Is
Get
that
out.
is that random enough?
Nice.
I enjoy riding motorcycles for fun, and I happen to be involved in the photography industry now for about 20 years. So I have a lot of experience in that realm.
Yeah. What's been your history in the photography world? Just give us a quick recap.
2001 to 2012, photographed weddings. During that time, I launched Photographers Edit. And so, what is that? Almost 15 years now that we've been around and built that into a multi-million-dollar company with my wonderful, wonderful team. I can't give them enough props for all that they've done in that process. But that's the very short version of it.
Cool. And then the Bokeh podcast. And when did you start that?
That was 2016, and it was a way to kind of reconnect with the industry. I'd kind of pulled back a little bit for some personal reasons, and so it gave me kind of selfishly a chance to have conversation with photographers again. But then adding value at the end of the day, I wanted to be able to add value. And you and I were just talking about this briefly before we got started, but at the time, the popular thing was blogging, right? Blog content for the sake of adding value. And I didn't want to go the same place that everybody else was going. And this was before podcasts had really blown up. So I went the direction of podcasting, and it's played out really nicely for us. And it's just been a cool opportunity to add value to the industry.
Nice. Nice. We'll talk about the cryptocurrency we're launching for the photography community.
Absolutely. Coming up soon. Yeah.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about brand positioning and why it's important. Nathan put together a list of five or so key points. Nathan, just want to kind of a big picture go over what the topic's about today, and then you can dive into the first point.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, we live in a super crowded space in the photography industry, right? I mean, even back when I was still actively shooting, it was relatively crowded. But because there is a very crowded marketplace or industry, I should say, it's a little bit more complicated for a potential client to find us. So the question is, how do we more effectively stand out in that noise, in that bit of chaos? And one of, I think, the most important and most effective ways to do just that is to have a clear and distinct brand position, which then will lead to creating a distinct brand position statement. We'll talk about how to go about that process today.
Mhm. Awesome. Let's dive in.
Sure thing. Yeah. Well, I think, and this is funny because I know that brand positioning is ultimately about marketing, but I like to think big picture, and I think it's good for all of us as photography business owners to do just that. So, really, the first thing that I encourage photographers to do in order to create a distinct and effective brand position is to first establish what I call a big picture view. And I got the idea for the phrase from a book called "Time Management from the Inside Out," Julie Morgenstern,
Okay.
and she said the most effective people in life have a big picture view that enables them to rise above the chaos, which is very fitting considering the conversation, and maintain their perspective. So, in order to create a brand position, which I would suggest ultimately is what you would build your whole business model around, we need to first establish the direction that we want to go with our life and then let that trickle down to our business. So
Mm-hmm.
it's very big picture thinking. But in my mind, the two most important components of that big picture view are number one, financial goals. So, of course, there's our basic financial needs, but then there are also the desires that we have, the vacations and the toys that we want to buy and so forth. So there's the financial component we need to consider, and being really clear about how much it is that we need to make in a week and a month and a year, and then how much we want to make in the next 5 years or 10 years. That helps us start to think a little bit about the type of business model that we want to develop to support that set of goals, right? There's the financial component, and there's that time component is the second component of that big picture view that it's super important. And why it matters is because, and I'm just going to throw a crazy number out there, but if I make a $500,000 a year, but I'm working 80 hours a week to make that money, to me, it defeats the purpose of being an entrepreneur because I want the freedom, I want the flexibility. So I need to find a balance between what my financial goals are and then what my time goals are. So that's where I would actually encourage photographers to start. It would be easy just to pick a position statement, but before you go there, consider where you actually want to go with your life, and then as a result with your business. And then that will help really narrow down the choice-making process of developing that brand position.
Yeah, it's interesting when people are in a position where they are completely broke and they have a ton of time.
Mm.
They're willing to trade all the time in the world for money. And when they get to a point though where their needs are being met, their financial needs, they can put food on the table, they're not behind on rent, whatever. That's where you start to say, okay, I want to buy back some of my time. And how do I get to a point where I can buy back as much time as possible and still be able to not only meet my needs, pay bills, whatever, but have excess in there to save, retirement, that type of thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think, and you're absolutely right in that state. And I certainly was there. Like when I started photographing weddings, it was, I think the first one was for like $350. And I, of course, lost money on that because it was filmed too. So we're developing the film. But as you're getting started, you just want to bring in business. You want to book clients. You want to put some cash in the bank and try to make ends meet. And there is a little bit more of a kind of a desperate behavior pattern there.
Mm-hmm.
As you begin to establish that business, though, it really is important to develop that bigger picture view. I can speak to the success that I had as a photographer, but I know that that success would have been multiplied 3x, 5x, or even more had I had that perspective back then.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was just kind of a haphazard dive into the photography industry.
Yeah.
But I think I just want to encourage photographers to think a little bit more, a little bit bigger picture, because it will not only enable them to certainly establish a more distinct and effective brand position, but in general, help them establish a more successful and healthy business. So, but that's the first place that I'd start would be with that big picture view.
Yeah. Donald Miller, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Absolutely.
He oftentimes talks about writing his obituary, not in
Mm.
a morbid way, but
Mhm.
basically put your life in perspective and say, hey, when I die, I want my life to mean this. I want my family to say this about me, and figure out what that is. What legacy do you want to live, or to leave behind, rather? And then work backwards from there, because
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to say, hey, this is the way that I want to be when I'm gone, or what I want to be remembered for when I'm gone, and kind of work backwards, as opposed to saying, okay, I'm here, whatever position I am in life, and coming up with just like random goals that might not actually satisfy you, or leave a legacy that is worth leaving.
It's true. And you summed it up brilliantly. It's what is the end goal? How do I get there? And that certainly applies in this case as well. Because ultimately, again, I think if we're applying a brand position and ultimately running our business based on that brand position we've established, literally everything on a day-to-day basis is going to revolve around that thing. And I'll explain more here in just a bit. But if we're running a business on that model, and we're running a business that's not based on what it is that we're trying to accomplish, both certainly professionally, but personally, ultimately, then it's not going to be nearly as fulfilling. We'll get burnt out more easily. So yeah, taking a step back and thinking about that end goal is really important.
Yeah, perfect. So,
So
yeah,
I once we establish that big picture view and that perspective, then the next step is a super simple and practical one, which is just simply to study the market. And as photographers, and I think back to when I was shooting as well, I had a certain amount of awareness about who was in my marketplace. I live in the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, and I started to develop some friendships in the community. But when I talk about developing awareness, what I want to do, if I'm going to create a distinct brand position, i.e., I want to have a unique value proposition, that's what we're talking about here, then I need to be aware of what's going on in the marketplace, what other photographers are doing, what they're saying, the style of photography that they're offering, maybe even their editing style, the copy that they're using on their website, the prices that they're charging, their target market. I want to develop an awareness of what is going on in my marketplace. So what I recommend to photographers is just do a quick Google search in the genre that you plan on working in. I was a wedding photographer, so I would search wedding photographer Chattanooga or wedding photography Chattanooga. And I would look at the first 3 or 4 pages of results that come up and literally go to each one of those photographers' websites and see exactly what I was just saying. How are they photographing? What are the services that they're offering? What are they charging? Their target market, the copy that they're using. If they so happen to have a brand position statement, it's not highly likely, but what is that? Because what I want to do then is not what is kind of the norm in the industry, which is just kind of copy paste, right? We look at other photographers that we like, we copy paste what they're doing. I actually want to do something opposite of what these photographers are doing in order to stand out effectively. So I'm going to take some notes as I'm going through those websites, and that will help begin to form an idea of the direction that I want to go. When photographers start to try to figure out, hey, what type of service am I going to offer? What am I going to charge for that particular service? And some of these similar questions, I think there's a tendency to kind of overcomplicate that conversation. What we really should be doing on this super simple practical level is looking at the marketplace and behaving accordingly. Or in another way, behaving in the opposite direction, right? Going the opposite direction. We see where the opportunity is, and that's where we go.
Yeah. Yeah. Seeing needs that aren't being met by your current or by the current market around you, or your competition or whatever. Yeah, there are components that are worth, I don't want to say copying, but they're worth like saying, okay, this is what a lot of people are doing and they're having success. And you don't want to just be like, okay, everybody's doing full day coverage, I'm going to do 1 hour coverage. It's like, no, you're not going to be hired for that. That's not the zigging and zagging that we're talking about. It's finding where there are holes that are not being met, or problems that are not being solved, and positioning yourself in a way that you're the one that's going to do that.
Yeah, and part of that, of course, will require some conversation, and maybe some further Google searching, looking at some data to see where those needs are. You make a great point. Again, though, that is much more practical, I think, than the tendency that we have. And by the way, I speak as a very emotional individual, as an emotional photographer. So I get the idea of decisions made based on feel and so-called intuition. But I think that we can get a little too carried away in that regard. And I've seen that trend in the photography industry for 20 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And that can ultimately inhibit us from creating a brand that could be as successful as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So being super practical, again, as you were saying, to look at where those opportunities are and going there versus just simply, I like this or I like that. There's a component of that, but let's just make sure not to prioritize that too much, because it gets in the way of seeing the very practical opportunities that are there in front of us.
Yeah. The other thing I notice a lot of times is photographers kind of go on this cycle, if you will, where they become successful and then they want to start educating, and they'll oftentimes start teaching everything that they did to get to the point where they are now. And so much goes into that: personality, your individual market. So people latch on to these photographers who have a system or whatever, and a lot of it's really great information. But if you don't have an extroverted personality and that person does, well, your approach to selling or your approach to reaching the market might not work. It might not be the same, because you can't just flip a switch and all of a sudden be somebody that you're not. So you have to find a way to reach your market in a way that fits who you are, so that you don't come across as a phony.
Yeah, that's a great point, and really a deep, dark rabbit hole we could probably go down pretty far. But
yeah.
You're right. Leveraging strengths is important. I think at the same time, if I can push back a little bit, a lot of photographers fixate on the notion of their personality type or their strengths, and a lot of times those so-called personality types are just behavioral patterns that they could learn to make adjustments for.
Sure.
Something that comes up in the industry quite a bit is this notion of being an introvert. And if we're going to be effective photographers and ultimately business owners, we are engaging with people that we're not familiar with, being in situations with people that we don't know, and learning what might be at the root of that tendency, that introvert tendency, is really, really important, because it will enable us to be better as business owners. But you're right, just simply copy pasting other photographers, not taking into consideration all the variables behind the choices that they've made, can be extremely distracting and ultimately limit us.
Absolutely.
So the next step then would be, on, again, very simple, practical level, just to choose the position. You've taken the time, and I would suggest that it might take a day or two, or at least a few hours, to sit down and establish that big picture view. What does that actually look like financially, time-wise? Might be a conversation with partner or otherwise. But then once you've done that market research, you've got the numbers that are driving your decision making, you're aware of what's going on in the marketplace, it's time to choose a position. And I would suggest there may be 4 different ways that you can go about picking a position. So the first is to be the first to offer a service. That's going to be pretty complicated to do in most marketplaces. You might be able to be the first dog photographer or cat photographer and say in a small marketplace, but most marketplaces are pretty well established. There's going to be 20, 30, 40, 50 photographers, or even more, depending on the size of the city. And but I want to at least throw that out there, because it's always a potential opportunity. But then the second place to go is to be the first to own a service. Now, this is a little bit nuanced, but if you're the first photographer to come out and say, I am, let's say, Chattanooga's premier wedding photographer, it's a little bit nuanced. It's certainly gutsy, to say the least. But if you're willing to actually go to the lengths necessary to be able to back that up, to provide an experience that far supersedes anything that anybody else in that marketplace is doing, that's another direction that we could go when we come to choosing that position statement or position, and then establishing that statement. The third direction we can go is to offer unique variation on a service. And this is where most photographers will likely go, and I think probably the easiest direction to go. So just as a simple example, if I were to launch a photography business here in Chattanooga, again, a wedding photography business, saying that I am a wedding photographer obviously doesn't make me unique. I'm just part of the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to say that I was Chattanooga's black and white wedding photographer, and literally all I photograph in or offer the images in is black and white,
Mm-hmm.
that will naturally make me stand out. So wedding photography is the service, black and white is the variation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another direction that I could go. I could say I'm wedding photography for Chattanooga seniors, i.e., if you're 65 and above and you need a wedding photographer, you're my target market.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually is a good segue to the next idea of choosing a position, which is to specify a market segment. And we can do this again in a variety of ways. We can call out a particular part of the area. I talk to photographers quite a bit that live in Texas, and when they talk about a city, it's such a broad area of that particular state. And so you may not necessarily specify a city. Maybe it's a region or larger segment of that area that you live in, but calling out the specific area or the market rather that you live in can be one way that you set yourself apart. But then again, you can also call out a segment of the market. Let's take that example from earlier. Let's say Chattanooga or black and white wedding photography for Chattanooga couples, I could say. But if I want to get more specific and call out a specific segment of the market, I could say black and white wedding photography for Chattanooga skateboarders.
Mm-hmm.
And now I've really, really niched down.
Mm-hmm.
The big caveat here, and some of you listening or watching may have already considered this, is that you first establish that big picture view. You know your financial goals. If you niche down too much, you're going to end up with too small a market to support those financial goals. So you have to take that in consideration. That will mean either going to a different market segment or widening your reach. Maybe you're going to focus on those skateboarders in Tennessee or in the Southeast region. But these are the different ways that you can go about choosing a unique position.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just like you said, niching down too far, it's very risky. But if you nail it and it's a large enough market, then you're good. But when you're first starting out, you have to have the work, you have to have the entire client experience to back up niching down that far, or else you get a bad reputation within that niche and you're toast. So be careful with it. Make sure that you have the skill set and ability to back up what you're wanting to do.
For sure. And then back to that awareness again too. I know I keep harping on it, but what I've realized in hindsight, and I've said this on my podcast many times over, my lack of attention to the data, and whether that was the financial data associated with my business or data when it came to customer acquisition, was I didn't have any awareness or education for that matter in that realm. Mm-hmm. And so I can't stress enough the importance of paying attention to the numbers. Now, what we started with was that idea of the big picture view. I know how much I need to make and want to make in a year, let's just say. That is going to help me determine that segment of the marketplace that I'm going after, amongst other things. And I can make that decision very logically because I know if that segment of the market is large enough to support those financial goals or not. So I'm going to go back to the data. Yeah, I'm a feelings guy. I get really excited about the idea of photographing skateboarders, for example. So I could make the decision based on the feeling, but I also have to consider the reality, and I can make those decisions based on data, and that's super important.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be on the demographic of people. It could be on the type of venue. You could say private estate weddings. I'm the leading private estate wedding photographer in southeastern Pennsylvania, or pick what type of venues are popular and typically attract a higher end clientele, and you can all of a sudden be the go-to photographer within that niche or whatever genre of photography you're talking about. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Don't feel like you just have to say, based on, old couples or young couples or, the style of photography. There's a lot of different ways to differentiate yourself with that.
That's a wonderful point. Absolutely. Yeah, the possibilities are endless. And yet it's funny how photographers just kind of get stuck saying a lot of the same thing, which really brings me to my next point. So once we've gone about that process of choosing the position, the direction that we're going to go, the brand position that we're going to establish for the sake of building our business, we want to refine the messaging. And this is an interesting one because a lot of the time, the photographers really across the country are using a lot of the same words, shall we say, pretty words or cute words or creative words in order to describe their business. And in many cases, they're kind of vague. And I wrote down this statement to kind of encapsulate, if you will, some of the things that I've seen in websites over the years. But hopelessly inspired by love, I capture the magical memories of life's most authentic in-between moments through the timeless beauty of natural light, right?
Right.
And in that phrase there, and I'm sure those listening and or watching might recognize one or two words or phrase that they've seen or maybe even used themselves. It's kind of funny, but the reality is if we're speaking to the average consumer market, let's say 98% of the market that has little to no context about photography,
Mhm.
and even what we may even be suggesting some of these words mean, they're going to be a little bit confused, or at the very least, when they land on the site, if that's what they see, it's going to be so vague to them, it's not going to grab their attention. So what I would suggest in this process of refining messaging, kind of this fourth step in establishing an effective brand position, is to use relevant language.
Mhm.
And really, to take it to the second component of that, just be practical and direct. Tell that potential client what it is that you do and how that is different than the other photographers in that same marketplace. And it's really as easy as that. I'll give another example here, because the next suggestion I want to make is to be simple in this process of refining the messaging, because a lot of photographers will have paragraphs of text on their site that a potential client may have to wade through, and they're bored after 5 seconds, right? So if we want to capture their attention with an effective position statement, a message there, the moment that they, or the second really that they land on the site, we need to keep it simple. 6 to 8 words is what I suggest.
Mhm.
On my editing company site, for example, I have our position statement is custom editing for professional photographers. What is that? 8 words. So in that particular context, I have editing, which is the service, custom, which is the variation on that service, and there's intention behind that, looking at the marketplace. And then for professional photographers, I'm talking to, it is a very broad spectrum, but I'm speaking specifically to professional photographers. And you can see how just in what 2 or 3 seconds that somebody jumps on that site, they immediately know both the service that we're offering and how we're different than maybe a different editing service.
Mhm.
My encouragement to everybody listening and watching would be to be super, well, first of all, use relevant language, but be practical, be direct, and be really, really simple. And the template really there to use, and I've kind of already alluded to it, is the service, the variation on that service. If you can call out the location, the marketplace that you're in, that's great. And then the target market, if that is relevant as well.
Yeah, I think the location is something that people take for granted way too much. You go to their website, you have no idea where they're based, and
Mm.
they're like, "Oh, well, people are doing a search for Philadelphia wedding photographers," and it's like, well, maybe, but they might stumble upon your website for one reason or another, and you're based in Nebraska. Like, I don't want to hire a photographer that's in Nebraska for a Philadelphia wedding, probably. Uh, so putting that on there is really helpful. And to your point of paragraphs and paragraphs, people are like, oh, it's good for SEO, but like if it ruins the client experience when they're on your website, is
Right.
it really good for SEO? Like, is it helping you book more clients, or is it making it harder for people to actually figure out your website when they're actually on it?
It's a great point. And again, if you go to the average photographer's website, there is just literally paragraphs of text. Sometimes there might even be, it's rare that a photographer I've seen actually puts a clear and distinct brand position on their site. If it's there, most of the time it's kind of buried in a paragraph of text.
Mhm.
Um, Understandable that we use text for the sake of SEO, and it's not mutually exclusive to this idea of a simple brand position statement. What we want, and where I'll go next here, is very simply to share that position statement prominently. What I mean by that very simply is to put that statement in big bold font above the fold. And what I mean by above the fold is simply that you're not scrolling in order to find it, right? So anything above that line before you start scrolling, whether on a desktop site or a mobile site, that position statement should be there prominently. And again, very easy, very quick to read, 2 to 3 seconds at most. And make sure that the moment they land on the site there, that's what they see. So they're now able to categorize you as that their potential photographer, whether or not this is a fit. If you have to put text on that site for the sake of SEO, do that, but do it further down. You want to give them just a quick bit to grab onto the moment they land there.
Absolutely.
And then this is, I guess, relatively simplistic in nature, but what I really want to encourage photographers to do is once they've established that brand position statement, they've put it there prominently on their site, they've copied that message across their social media profiles for the sake of consistency in their brand presentation. Actually making sure that you're backing up the message with the experience is really important, because I've seen this countless times where a photographer, for example, might say, I'm a photojournalistic wedding photographer. And then you go to their website or you go to their Instagram feed, and what you see is highly stylized, kind of fashion-esque wedding photography, just as one example.
Hmm.
If you're going to say something, it's easy to say something, right? And this is a good life lesson in general. It's easy to say something. The question is, what are you actually doing with what you're saying? Are you actually following through on that? And for the sake of the client, whether it's subconscious or they're actually aware of what's going on, you can potentially create confusion if you're saying one thing but then presenting another, or you're saying one thing and then giving them a whole different kind of experience. So if you're going to position yourself on this particular hill in order to stand out in your busy marketplace, make sure that you're actually following through in what you're saying.
Mhm.
Back that up. If I'm a black and white wedding photographer in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the last thing I'm going to do is post a color picture anywhere. I want to maintain consistency in that brand presentation, or excuse me, well, certainly the presentation, but to, of course, back up the message. And
Mhm.
that's really, really important. Again, it may seem simplistic, but I've seen too much inconsistency in that regard. So I just want to encourage photographers to actually follow through on that message.
Yeah. And to add to all of that, once you've gotten all this stuff in alignment, you have your positioning, you have your wording, you have everything lined up. If you have an awful client experience for your customers, if you're replying to their emails days later and all that stuff, none of
Mm,
this matters. So
right.
you need to make sure that the infrastructure of how you're operating your business, how fast you are to respond, how clear you are with your messaging. When you respond in an email or a text message to the client, are you proofreading? Are you making sure that you don't sound like you just, responded real quick and then sent a text message?
Right.
Maintain that messaging throughout their entire experience, so that if you're presenting as a luxury wedding photographer, or whatever niche it is, that you're not coming across completely different than whatever it is that you're showing prior.
That's so true. And I'll add this little kind of bit of bonus here as I'm finishing, and that because you're talking about the significance of time, the way that photographers are managing their time. What's really interesting is once you have, again, kind of starting from the beginning, built that big picture view for yourself, so you know what it is that you're trying to reach for long term, certainly immediately, but also long term. That literally drives everything that you do first with establishing that brand position, but then as a result, on the day-to-day basis, literally everything that you do on a day-to-day basis is going to then revolve around that brand position. Because what are you trying to do? Exactly what you were just saying. Support that brand position. You want to follow through on that. What's cool about that, though, is that I can now filter out everything else that's irrelevant. If it doesn't support what I'm trying to achieve, certainly financially, but with my brand and my brand position, then there's no need for me to be paying attention there. I can focus all of my attention, effort, and energy, and also my marketing efforts even on this one thing, which helps encourage clarity, but it also helps encourage better management of time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's it. As simple as that.
Good.
Then now the question is, are you going to apply
Yeah.
it?
I oftentimes have, people are like, oh, if you could have a superpower, what would it be? Honestly, I'm always like, I want to apply everything that I've learned. And
Yeah.
I read a book, and if I come away and I actually apply one or two things from that book, I feel like it's a win.
Mm.
You read whatever, Atomic Habits, or this book or
Hmm.
that book, and it's like there's so much good stuff in there, and you want to come away with application.
Mm.
So real quick, go through the list again. Just give like one quick bullet point on something actionable people can do from each bullet point.
Yeah. So establish a big picture view. How much do you need to make, and in what amount of time?
Mm-hmm.
You need to take the time to figure that out. Study your market. Literally Google your genre of photography and the marketplace you're going to be in. Look at the results, develop market awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Choose that position. We talked about how to go about doing that. Really, it's just a matter of doing it. You got to pick it, you got to commit to it.
Mm-hmm.
Refine your messaging. Less is more. So once you've written out that position statement, cut it by 30, 40, 50% if at all possible. Keep it simple, keep it relevant, keep it practical, and then share that position. Make sure, and if you need to work with your developer to do this, absolutely make sure that you've got that position statement big, bold, and above the fold. And again, not just on the desktop site, the big site, but also on your mobile site, because of course, a large percentage of your potential clients are going to go to that mobile site first.
Awesome. Well, that was very helpful. I hope everybody that's watching now and watching in the future gets a lot of value from that, and that they actually take action on these steps. It's not a ton of work.
Mm,
Figuring out these little minor tweaks that you need to do to see how you position within your local market and the market that you're trying to reach. You can do it in an afternoon and make those tweaks to your website. It's not. We're not talking months. Yes, it might take months to get to the point where you're actually known for whatever niche. Months, years before you're known for that niche, but getting to the point where you're moving in that direction doesn't take long. So thank you for sharing all that stuff. If people want to tune into the Bokeh podcast, how do they do that?
Literally just search Bokeh, Bokeh podcast. And I've actually done a large number of brand position consultations on the show.
Okay.
So if you go to, if anybody listening or watching wants to even just go to bokehpodcast.com and search brand position consultation, you'll see large number of episodes come up. And for anybody listening in who's like, man, I mean, I get it, but I can't quite translate that to what I'm doing in my business. I want to make more sense of it. Listening to some of those consultations will be super helpful and practical.
Awesome. And for Photographers Edit, if they want to check that out, what give us your best pitch, your elevator pitch here on that.
It's literally that position statement I mentioned earlier. It's custom editing for professional photographers. What does that mean? We match your editing style. And that's has been the focus for years, actually. And that's what kind of sets us apart. So pretty much any option you could potentially imagine, if it reflects your editing style, we're going to match that. And what that, of course, does, the big benefit is that it gives you so much more time in the end to do the types of things we talked about today, which is those activities are going to actually help grow your business, build your brand.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, photographersedit.com, just like it sounds. We'd be glad to work with you.
Awesome. Anything else you have going on you want to share about?
We do have, so for new photographers, let's say in your first 3 years of business, we've got a conference coming up. It's called the Newbie Photographer Conference, but it's spelled Noobie. So newbieconference.com, more information there. We're going to host it here in Chattanooga in January, and really excited about what we're doing with that. It's a small conference though. So if you're interested, make sure you get in while you can, but that's newbieconference.com.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Very helpful conversation, hopefully for everybody. And yeah, people tune in, check out Photographers Edit as well. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan. This has truly been a privilege.
Yeah.